So our speakers this morning are also the organisers. They've been very busy then on all fronts. And our first speaker is Jemima Jobling. Jemima is a second-year PhD student in French studies at Newcastle University. She studied French and Russian at Downing College at the University of Cambridge, where she also completed a Phil in European, Latin American and comparative literatures and cultures. Jemima's research interests lie in contemporary women's writing and visual art, with particular focus on questions of social class, sexuality and the body. And her PhD thesis explores expressions of social class in the works of Annie Ernaux, Christine Angot and Virginie Despentes. And Jemima's, the title of Jemima's paper is Navigating Space and Class in Annie Ernaux's Mémoire de fille of 2016. And this, she says, is an exploration of class-based anxiety as told through the text's intimate bedroom spaces. Our second speaker is Jessica Rushton. Jessica is a first-year PhD student at Durham University. She achieved a first-class BA honours degree in French and Francophone Studies at the University of Nottingham, and she went on to complete her Master of Studies in Modern Languages at Oriel College, Oxford, where she received a distinction. Jessica's current research investigates the representation of the rebellious maidservant in 19th century French literature and the ways in which this figure is transposed into 20th and 21st century literature and cinema through the avatars of the nanny, the cleaner, and the concierge. And the title of Jessica's paper is Destabilizing the 19th Century Maidservant Revolt Narrative, Leila Slimani's Chanson Douce. And this is an investigation into how Slimani's nanny figure echoes a 19th century discourse around the rebellious maidservant. So thank you very much, speakers and co-organisers, for putting this inaugural seminar together. And now I will hand it over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Shelley, and thank you, everyone. It's really nice to see you all, albeit through a screen. I'm just gonna, I hope this works. I hope you can all see my presentation and can still hear me. I think, okay, brilliant, lovely. Okay, so my paper today is adapted from a chapter of my thesis and focuses on Ernaux's most recent text, Mémoire de fille. This text has been dubbed the precious missing piece of her oeuvre, as it details a hitherto omitted period of the writer's young adult life working at a holiday camp or colonie in the summer of 1958. Though fascinating explorations of ideas surrounding complicity and around the themes of time and memory have recently been published, there remains the question of class, the crux of my PhD research, and of what Mémoire de fille can illuminate for us in terms of class experience and expression. I consider class in this text through the lens of access and exclusion, and examine how the tensions of class existence of working class adolescents are narrated through the spaces that the young Annie D encounters, and the various anxieties that they, and the struggle to inhabit, claim and navigate them, engender. Annie D here being the way that writing Ernaux refers to her premarital adolescent self. So intense preoccupations with questions of containment and transgression, with questions of an inside and outside, and with the struggle to claim space, run through Mémoire de fille. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the descriptions of the bedroom spaces, of the various chambres she inhabits or visits. To begin, in Mémoire de fille, Ernaux reprises a very specific and metaphorical image of chambre she earlier famously outlines in Les Années, and I think also in Je ne suis pas sortie de ma nuit. So she evokes Dorothea Tanning's 1942 self-portrait Birthday. So she writes, she often revisits images of herself single in the streets of cities where she has walked and in the rooms she has occupied, in a young ladies' hostel in Rouen, in Finchley as an au pair, on holiday in Rome. These are herselves, it seems to her, who continue to exist in these places. In a Dorothea Tanning painting she saw in a show 3 years before in Paris, a bare-chested woman stands before a row of doors that stand ajar. The title was Birthday. She thinks this painting represents her life. Similarly expressed, yet perhaps less romantically envisaged in Mémoire de fille, here Ernaux hopes that the act of writing might actually throw wide open these half-open doors, and provide unbridled access to her past self or selves of 1958. She expresses a desire that writing, given access to that summer, as simple and direct as moving from one room to another. This surrealist image that Ernaux here paints provides not only a fascinating springboard for my discussion, but also a stark contrast to the very intentional restriction of access and ejection from space that Annie D finds herself subject to, and the class-based spatial anxiety she feels surrounding the spaces and places in Mémoire de fille. What interests me here is how class relations are described, played out, exposed, and emotionally engaged with in these spaces. First and foremost, this spatial anxiety is foregrounded through a nervousness about the outside world, the dehors. Mémoire de fille, as we have already mentioned, details a period of time in the young Annie D's life when she spends a summer working at a colonie, a time, crucially, when she is able to fly the family nest for the first time. As she self-disparagingly states, she has never left her hole. The young woman's anxiety around the dehors, or perhaps the hors norme, is foregrounded as an inherited trait, a product of her working-class provincial roots. Only child, mollycoddled, the outside world is the object of worry for her father and of suspicion for her mother. Nevertheless, this frisson of fear is one that is twinned with a frisson of excitement, a burning desire to leave and to escape the spatial, social, and maternal confines of Yvetot, her hometown. Of the moment her mother takes her to the train station in Rouen, Ernaux writes, "I know what this girl is feeling at this precise moment. I know her desire, the only one inside her, that her mother scalpers and takes the train back in the opposite direction." A list of Annie D's more general adolescent desires follows shortly after. Leave Yvetot, escape the gaze of her mother, enter into an unknown world. A list meted out by verbs of motion that convey her yearning for flight and freedom of movement. Her arrival at the colonie thus marks a huge moment of liberation. As she writes, "I see her arriving at the colonie like a filly escaped from the pen or enclosure." This image captures perfectly the double-edged nature of this frisson. The pouliche échappée conjures up a climactic feeling of emancipation, and yet with it a sense of unbridled, untamed wildness. The continuation of this quotation only confirms this anxious ambivalence, alone and free for the first time, a bit fearful. The choice of the word pouliche also suggests a youthful, small-town naivety that adds to the heavy sense of foreboding that characterizes the opening section of the text. On the stage that Ernaux sets for Mémoire de fille, the innocent hopefulness of the young woman who writes to her friends in a tone described as vibrant, excited, is consistently offset by an ominous insistence on her obliviousness to events about to unfold. Ernaux stresses Annie D's desire, her madness, her idiocy, and upon arrival at the colonie, reiterates her ignorance about what will be behind her forever in 3 days. Ernaux also conveys this anxiety through pacing and rhythmic choices. She holds us, alongside the ghostly figure of Annie D, at the door of the colonie. A full 10 pages pass between her arrival and the eventual crossing of the threshold. The writer keeps us in this frozen, uncertain position, continually tantalizing us with reminders of Annie's and our imminent entry into a world and a space, much anticipated but entirely unknown. Constant punctuating reminders such as, "I have not yet crossed the threshold of the colonie," and "Here is the girl who will enter the colonie," create a sense of delaying of the inevitable. Note also how the varied uses here of past and future tenses add to this feeling of time stretching out. This suspension of the reader in an anticipatory position means that we share in the young Annie D's anxiety when, eventually, the threshold is crossed and, this time, she entered. Class-born anxieties surround not only Annie's entry into the space of the colonie, or, if we will, the entry into the dehors of the unknown, but also her inhabiting and claiming of space once there. How intimidated and dwarfed she feels is instantly made evident through the language used to describe the setting. For example, monumental, long, immense, dizzyingly tall or high. Immediately following the evocation of this dizzying image, our narrator stresses the relative ease and confidence with which her peers approach and navigate the space of the colonie. All the girls behave with ease and determination. For example, her roommate has already taken the bed close to the window and set up her stuff. Shackled by an intense sense of class alienation and inferiority, Annie cannot occupy the, albeit shared, space in the same way. It seems to her that the space of the bedroom belongs more to her roommate than to her. This anxiety around the claiming of space is sustained through into Annie D's navigations of the spaces of sex. Her first sexual experience with a holiday camp moniteur chef, referred to throughout Mémoire de fille, euphemistically simply as H, is the much anticipated yet ultimately traumatic crux of this novel. There is much to be made of critically in this scene, not least the troubling absence of explicit consent and perceived agency. But for now, I'll be thinking this scene spatially in terms of entrapment. The very location in which this encounter takes place, in her own room, a space that, as we know, she feels no claim over nor ownership of, is already one steeped in anxiety. Ernaux's play here, once again with rhythm, draws the reader into this experience and into this nervous, powerless space. The passage detailing H and Annie D's first night together features uncharacteristically short sentences that naturally increase a readerly tempo. He whispers, "Shall we leave?" She says yes. It's cold. He forces. It hurts her. She cries out. She is cold. The repetition of foi here adds an additional element of cyclicality and only serves to add to the sense of dizzying entrapment, and we are carried along with the rhythm of the passage as Annie is swept along in the acts she so barely understands. In contrast to the entrapment and containment evoked here in her own space, H's bedroom is a space from which she is repeatedly shut out or rejected. She is consistently ridiculed by the other girls at the colonie, and when one particularly cruel trick is played, the moniteur chef looks on silently and self-assuredly, keeper of his own castle. H, imposing, motionless at the door of his bedroom, observing and smiling with the indulgence of a responsible elder. Annie's attempts to seek comfort with him are similarly coldly rejected. She goes to throw herself into his arms. He keeps them firmly at his sides. He turns away and goes back into his room. Later in the text, a broken promise of an early morning visit from H prompts Annie to investigate. What follows is an acutely symbolic scene that once again reiterates these class questions of access and exclusion. At dawn, as he hasn't come, she is going to bang on his door. It's silence. She thinks that he is still sleeping. She returns several times, I've forgotten how many. The final time, after having knocked, she tried to open the door. The lock was on. She looked through the keyhole. He was just within eyeshot, his back to her, pajamaed, stretching. He didn't open the door. Annie D's formative sexual experiences in the colonie are intensely bound up then with a heavy sense of class shame, a shame rooted in naivety and nervousness, in innocence and ignorance, and the predication of these experiences on a power imbalance deepen the association of this romantic rejection with class shame. The spatial senses of entrapment and inclusion that Ernaux employs to tell this hitherto untold story culminate in the eventual rejection of Annie's application to work at the colonie for a second year. Of receiving the fateful letter, she writes, I'd perhaps already anticipated the rejection that it contained, the terms of which I have forgotten, and that brutally confirmed my certainty. Annie Duchesne was not wanted at the colonie. We no longer wanted, under any circumstances and to the highest degree, to hear about this girl. The triply emphasised sense of rejection, only compounded by the almost aggressively dissociative cette fille, denotes a rather safely assumed rearticulation of the terms of the official letter, and underlines the waves of pain and shame it caused, and perhaps continued to cause, Annie D. Ernaux ties off this damning expression of ostracism with the redoubling of the entrapment felt at the colonie. The shame was indelible, enclosed in the walls of the colonie. Though Annie D's shame remains hauntingly under lock and key, the psychological turmoil of the summer of '58 nevertheless lives on. In the following months described, Annie enrolls at a lycée in Rouen, where she is assigned her own bedroom in the convent, a second for our analysis here. Sadly, what should for the young girl be a new chance, a new start, and crucially, a new space to claim, becomes nothing more than a space of despair. Ernaux devotes 4 full pages of Mémoire de fille to describing a tiny photograph of Annie's chambre box in Rouen. This photo here, chambre box in Rouen, a photograph that first appeared in her 2011 anthology Écrire la vie, which is where I've scanned this, so I'm sorry about the quality, I couldn't find it online. So though the photograph itself is not actually provided in Mémoire de fille, the obsessively minute detail with which it is described means a reader cannot help but, quote-unquote, see the scene. Ernaux runs through the seemingly unremarkable features. A couple of books lay open on a small desk. Above it, a summer dress hangs, and partially obscured on either side of the frame, a door with a glass panel, and a bed with a metal frame. However, with closer reading, this particular 4-page passage, and this particular bedroom space once again raise and reiterate these classed questions of access, exclusion, and privacy. The door to the room, first and foremost, features a glass panel at the top, which allows you to see inside from the corridor. The one-sided terms with which this viewing window is described, presumably this is also a panel through which one might look out into the corridor from inside, evokes the feeling of a cell and introduces an oppressive sense of surveillance and lack of privacy. This issue of privacy and of claim over space continues to resurface throughout the passage as Ernaux's rightly magnifying glass spans the scene, picking out signs of the room's previous iterations and of grime left by former occupants. She describes how the intense beam of light in the photograph makes the dark traces of grime above the handle stand out, as well as the mark left by the removal of what appears to have been a lock. Mere pages apart, the absent lock of the box room in Ernaux echoes the prohibitive lock on H's bedroom door at the colonie, underlining further this incredibly classed and gendered disparity of access to and claim over space, private or otherwise. The summer dress that hangs in the centre of the frame undoubtedly constitutes the main compositional focus of the image. Ernaux, in keeping with the initial investigatory precision of this passage, at first describes the dress in flat, unadorned detail. There is a sleeveless summer dress hanging on the dividing wall. It is hooked by its armholes onto 2 white enamel balls serving as a hanger. It is a dress printed with colourful patterns, floral or arabesque, gathered at the waist with many pleats. However, as we read on, it becomes clear that the dress has deeper significance and carries deeper symbolism than were it a simple fact of the photograph. In stark contrast to this language here, on the next page, we read a much stranger, much more metaphorical description. She writes, "There was something strange about that empty dress, upon which the balls of the makeshift hanger made one think of 2 enormous, white, blind eyes, a sort of headless creature. The dress here becomes a sort of uncanny, haunting spectre whose eyes, though blind, look back into the room, look back at the camera lens, and intensify once again a sense of surveillance and of lack of privacy." It is in the continued description of the small writing desk that we learn of, as is arguably customary in Ernaux, the quite self-conscious construction of the piece, here the photograph. She writes, "I remember having moved the table from where it was habitually, under the window, pushing it next to the bed so that it would feature in the photo in this way. Likewise, when we read of the dress that there is something luxurious about it against the ambient destitution, we might begin to wonder just how much set dressing went into the making of this photograph." Though Ernaux claims not to understand or remember the motivation behind the capturing of this image, she does offer one speculative explanation. "Perhaps I wanted to keep track of a misfortune and of a metamorphosis that today seemed to me to be symbolised by the 2 objects in the centre of the photo. The dress that was the one that I wore the most at the colonie the previous summer, and the table where I spent so many hours studying philosophy. The heavy symbolic weight of the dress and of the writing desk is not lost on Mémoire de fille's narrator, nor, perhaps, was it lost on Annie D herself when she curated and captured the photo in 1959. Either way, the spectral presence of the traumatic and humiliating experiences that colonie, embodied in the dress and compounded by its exuberant prettiness, lives on in the chambre box at Ernaux. Widening our focus further and beyond the room itself, Annie D's experience in Rouen is one of isolation, where class differences are incredibly apparent and once again at the forefront of the 18-year-old's mind. She once again clumsily navigates her way around this new social and physical space. On her first day and upon her mother's departure, Annie's obliviousness to social norms means that she taps at the door of the neighbouring room. To the curly-haired brunette who opens the door and looks at her, surprised and embarrassed, she says enthusiastically, "Hello, my name's Annie, and you?" This will be their sole exchange, because her neighbour is a trainee hairdresser, and because the hairdressing girls, and those who go to high school or university, live side by side without speaking, eat at separate tables in the canteen. Here, Ernaux again reprises a spatial image of the frustrated or failed exchange in the doorway to convey a sense of class anxiousness, to illustrate Annie D's lack of class awareness, and to show how this affects her movement through and claiming of space. Furthermore, in Rouen, as at the colonie, the, however unsuccessful navigation of this new space is complicated and intensified by an oscillating tension between a stifling sense of entrapment or containment and an isolating sense of exclusion. So we learn that she feels immersed in an atmosphere of impalpable superiority that intimidates her, yet also that she is an observer of others, of the casual and natural way they declare, in Bergson we find, and next year I'll be studying at Sciences Po. A stranger, like the Camus novel she will read in October. Ungainly and unlucky in the midst of these girls in their pink blouses, their well-educated innocence, and their proper genitals. The young ID finds the space of the convent in Rouen no easier to navigate than that of the colonie, and thus finds herself once again on the edges. As the accompanying text to this bedroom photograph in Écrit à la vie attests, me, I was outside of everything. The bedroom space at Ernaux is undoubtedly infused with an intense isolation and sadness. More importantly for our purposes here, however, it also symbolises a catastrophic colliding and realisation of two axes of repression and struggle, class and sex-based shame and unease. She writes, all afternoon, I reread The Second Sex. Progressively, I felt myself become once again the being I was in 1959, reading this incredible book at Ernaux, surrounded by its overwhelming truth. To summarise, I grew up without social shame, without sexual shame. Both of these fell upon me. The latter during the summer of '58, the double alienation from which I draw everything that I write. This double alienation finds its symbolisation in the two main features of the photograph. The dress, an ominous reminder of the sexual shame of the colonie, and the table, a space of hope, social ascension and betterment. As I have here explored, Ernaux uses the chambre spaces of Mémoire de fille to map out, to anchor and to express the class-based anxieties of a young transfuse de classe. Annie Deeve's clumsy navigation of these spaces, as with our own readerly navigation, highlights class issues surrounding place, belonging, access and exclusion. In an extract from her journal intime, we learn that Ernaux once feared she might never find the words to write the summer of '58. She imagined that it might ultimately take a more visual form, more like a series of images, she suggests. This paper has, I hope, shown what illuminating conclusions can be drawn about class expression and oppression when we consider the finished textual product, Mémoire de fille, as instead une suite de chambre. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jemima. That was really insightful. I'd just like to thank everybody, and I hope you're still awake and you're ready for part 2, which is me. So this comes from a working paper at the moment. I'm in first year, so any sort of feedback is great. My translations all come from Sam Taylor. So this is the lullaby, but originally chanson douce. So my paper is, if you're all ready, you can all breathe and, have a drink. But yes, destabilising the 19th century maid-servant narrative, Leila Slimani's Chanson douce. Leila Slimani's Chanson douce, or Lullaby, depicts the blood-curdling story of a French nanny who murders 2 Parisian children in her care. Slimani's nanny Louise can be read as a 21st century avatar of the French 19th century literary figure of the rebellious maidservant. Like the bonne à tout faire, the maid of all work, whose role in the household was crucial to its efficient and clean appearance, Louise's services become indispensable for the Massy family to live their lives freely. Louise voluntarily goes beyond her role as a nanny, gradually taking on multiple duties in the household: cleaning, cooking, reorganising the family's items, repairing their clothes, attending parents' evenings, and dance recitals. Slowly, the nanny infiltrates the household, even sleeping in at their apartment twice a week or more. This paper demonstrates how Slimani's narrative uses and subverts a 19th century discourse of fear that surrounded the servant figure as a stranger in the home through its representation of the 21st century figure of the nanny. Part 1 of this paper explores how Chanson douce distorts the ethnic expectations inherited from 19th century representations of master and servant relationships. The traditional white bourgeoisie master and mistress are replaced by a modern, mixed heritage bobo couple who employ a white French nanny. This also reverses the real-life identities that feature in the 2012 news report that inspired Chanson douce. In New York, a nanny of Dominican origin killed 2 middle/upper-class white children she was looking after. By reversing the expectations of an ethnicity incorporated in the traditional master and servant relationship, Slimani's text emphasises the intersectionality of class and race and how these categories reinforce marginalisation. In part 2, I then explain how Chanson douce subverts and transforms a 19th century discourse which emerged as part of a genre which I'm going to label Le Roman de la Servante, the Book of the Servant, by analysing how Louise echoes the strategies of revolt used by vengeful maidservant protagonists, as well as the real-life 1933 maidservant killer case, the Papin sisters, which had major cultural resonance in France. The methods of revolt that fictional maids and their avatars have at their disposal in order to break away from their submissive role will be read by means of certain theories provided in Georges Didier Huberman's recent study, Désirer désobéir, ce qui nous soulève, part 1. And this is going to be actually the theory that hopefully I'm going to use in my thesis. So this includes his 4 categories of uprising or soulèvement, which he labels gestural, verbal, psychological, and atmospherical. And then he then breaks this down into thoughts, words, emotions, gestures, forms, and actions. I'm going to particularly focus on the Nanny Louise's revolt through thought and gesture in this paper. So if we're all ready to get going, I'm going to start with part 1, which is subverting race in the master-servant, employee-employer relationship. The masses seem besotted by the arrival of a white nanny who stands in sharp contrast with the immigrant women who have failed to meet their criteria. There is not a hair out of place on Louise's head. Her nails are delicately painted. Her shoes are spotless from her incessant and borderline obsessive shoe shining. Miriam Massey, a woman of North African descent, hypocritically seems to choose her image of an ideal and safe nanny through her potentially racist and prejudiced perspective. She chooses the stern white woman for her nanny. The mother's logic, however, proves flawed, as revealed through the horrific consequences of her decision. Célimène thus underpins how society views roles of class and race. Louise's husband, Jacques, demonstrates this through his racist comment how these roles of race and class are perceived as interconnected. He states, only black women do work like that now. It is insinuated that the job role traditionally belongs to lower class citizens, especially immigrants who form a surrogate working class. In an interview, Célimène has also stated that, quote, a white woman doing an immigrant's job is incredibly demeaning, end quote. The reversal of roles between the lower class immigrant worker and the white employee in Chanson douce can be traced back to the comic trope of master and servant swapping roles in 18th century French theatre. Marivaux's L'Île d'Esclaves, for example, features a utopic island where master and servants are forced to reverse roles. The servants become the masters of their masters and mistresses as an act of vengeance for the suffering they have had to withstand in their jobs. This reverse of class then occurs in the 19th century with characters such as Stendhal's Mine de Wengel and Barbé d'Aurevilly's Haute Claire from Le Bonheur dans le Crime, who take charge of their destinies by manipulating their positions as maidservants through disguises. Georges Sand's Indiana is also applicable to the race reversal in Célimène's text, and if I had time I would go into depth in this. So situated in the context of the 21st century, Célimène reappropriates and subverts master and servant role reversal to produce race role reversal. This technique not only highlights how race and class are interconnected in modern France, but how for Célimène, role reversal is also an act of vengeance on behalf of immigrant women. She states, "It was a revenge for me to say that we, the immigrants, can be the boss sometimes," end quote. Although Célimène seems explicit in her comment, her novel is ambivalent in demonstrating this so-called revenge. At the end of Chanson douce, the immigrant employer ultimately suffers horrifically, making the reader question the real message that Célimène is conveying in the novel. While the immigrant is positioned as the boss, this revenge is tainted with blood. The race reversal in Chanson douce reappropriates a 19th century discourse surrounding the white mistress and the black maid, a dichotomy that appears in 19th century works by Flaubert, Zola, Maupassant, for example. In her chapter, The Black Maid and Her Mistress, Jennifer Yee concludes that at times the maid stands metonymically in lieu of synecdoche, that is, she functions as a way of exercising certain parts of her mistress. For example, the black maid stands for her mistress's exotic side by descriptive metonymy, and in opposition of her mistress's whiteness by contrastive metonymy. By subverting the roles of race in Chanson douce, Célimène arguably reverses this idea of metonymy through her 21st century avatar of the maidservant. Reading Louise as a servant character who exemplifies her mistress's exoticism by contrastive metonymy is perhaps an unconvincing reading. Rather, I hope I'm going to show you, if I do my job, how Louise represents an incarnation of postnatal psychosis that Miriam originally felt as a mother confined to her home. At the beginning of Chanson Douce, Miriam feels overwhelmed by her duties as a stay-at-home mother. She feels like she's lost her identity, she can't go out, she can't see her friends. Daily life becomes relentless, altering even how she views her children. Quote, Mila's tantrums drove her mad. Adam's first burblings left her indifferent. With each passing day, she felt more and more desperate to go for a walk on her own. Sometimes she wanted to scream like a lunatic in the street. They're eating me alive, she would think. End quote. After experiencing these strong emotions of turmoil in respect to her life and children, Miriam decides to return back to work as a lawyer. So she hires a nanny to free herself from these difficulties, consequently placing these hardships on Louise. By the end of the novel, Louise can be read as embodying an extreme form of Miriam's postnatal depression. The nanny is submerged by her work and her sense of loneliness, feeling herself slipping into madness. Quote, the children's cries irritate her. She's ready to scream too. The children's nagging whines, their foghorn voices, their whys, their selfish desires seem to split her skull. Louise can't stand it anymore. She has no patience for their tears, their tantrums, their hysterical excitement. Sometimes she wants to put her fingers around Adam's neck and squeeze until he faints. End quote. So, as you can see, both women respond irritably, feeling the need to scream and escape their situations that confine them to the household. Louise's breakdown exemplifies the possible extremity of Miriam's emotions as she not returned to work. Unlike Miriam, Louise lacks the means to change her position. Her lack of education, money, and family support leaves the nanny in a precarious situation. It's arguably this oppressive situation that causes Louise to seek escapism through the revolt of violence. And this can be read in terms of Didier Huberman's theory that when one uprises or revolts, or even in order for one to uprise, a people must always begin from a state of powerlessness. So the nanny's position of inferiority paradoxically provides the character with the strength she requires to revolt. It's her oppressed existence as a service that causes her heightened emotions of hostility and bitterness, which take the form of different soulèvements, or uprising. And if we're all ready to go again, I've now got part 2, which is going to talk about these soulèvements, or the nanny revolt. So this is the section called Reappropriating the 19th Century Roman de la Servante into the 21st century. So in the late 18th century, there was a reorientation of the notions of the family that had implications on how the 19th century would then view its servants. The traditional patriarchal family was replaced by a more modern, more affectionate, more egalitarian, and more child-centred one, which consequently meant that servants were expelled from the private sphere of the family. The class war produced in the French Revolution only exasperated these fears. The loyal servant character in 19th century French literature, which I'm sure many of us have read about or know of, is then born out of these fears, representing this ideal servant in the eyes of the bourgeoisie. So one may think of Balzac's Grand Nanon in Eugénie Grandet, Lamartine's Geneviève, Histoire d'une servante, which was an early inspiration for Flaubert's Un cœur simple. Yet bourgeoisie suspicions about servants were starting to be embodied by the protagonists of a new genre of French literature. And I say new genre in the sense that the work has not been done on this yet to claim it as a genre. And this is hopefully where my thesis is going to go. Because this is a new protagonist in the sense that she defines a set of genre that seeks revenge and often has a hidden double life. So these maidservant protagonists disrupt the bourgeoisie order around them, arguably seeking to find a sense of autonomy through different strategies of revolt. Fictions within this genre, such as Stendhal's Mine de Wengel, the Goncourt brothers' Germanie la Certeau, and Mirabeau's Le Journal d'une femme de chambre, arguably act as performative texts. That is to say that they embody, as well as add to, the century's discourse around the rebellious maidservant in the bourgeoisie home. In the 19th century imagination, masters feared the maidservant as a figure who could potentially steal from them, kill them in their sleep, or contaminate their household. This is the discourse of a vengeful servant, which I argue is transposed into the 21st century novel, Chanson Douce. Anger rises up inside of Louise when she becomes faced with the unsuccessful reality of her life. Quote, when she opens the door to her studio flat, her hands start to shake. She wants to tear apart the sofa's slipcover, to punch a window. A sort of shapeless, painful magma burns inside of her, and it takes an effort of will to stop herself from screaming, end quote. This anger can be read through Didier Huberman's theory of how gestures of uprising are threatened by interior forces that produce through a process, forces through a process he labels as tourner vinaigre, to turn sour. So he states vinegar, like the name indicates, is a bitter wine. Through the production of acetic acid, it connotes affliction. The nanny's loneliness and her oppressive position as a service rather than as a family member augments her bitterness. Didier Huberman expands on this concept, discussing le vinaigre radical as something that attacks with force where one applies it. This can be applied to the way Louise works tirelessly in her role and how she attacks a sort of source of her oppression through different strategies of soulèvement, or uprising. Louise's violent thoughts in this scene can be read as an internal revolt relating to Didier Huberman's category of soulèvement, thoughts. Her thoughts are similar to those of Mirbeau's maidservant Célestine, whose heightened emotions of hostility against her employers cause her to revolt through thought. Despite my pain, she says, I would have smacked her. Louise and her 19th century counterpart demonstrate, therefore, Didier Huberman's theory that one can't refuse, disobey, revolt, uprise without violence to a degree of some sort. Chanson douce intensifies this connection between internal revolt and physical violence by describing the evil thoughts in Louise's mind. Someone has to die. Someone has to die for us to be happy. Morbid refrains echo inside of Louise's head when she walks. End quote. Louise's lack of control over these voices demonstrates her unstable mental health. Unlike Célestine, who seems to control her violence by instead choosing to commit theft, Louise acts upon her violence through murder. Murder is not, however, Louise's only act of revolt against her employers. Earlier in the novel, Louise feels humiliated when she is reprimanded for feeding the children out-of-date food. The nanny is obsessed with not seeing food go to waste, a reflection on Louise's compulsive behaviour. Considering her employers as selfish bobo consumers, Louise seeks revenge through action, or to use Didier Huberman's category, a geste of revolt, by placing a stale chicken in the centre of their kitchen. So here's the quote. There, in the middle of the little table where the children and their nanny ate, full stop. A chicken carcass sits on a plate, full stop. A glistening carcass without the smallest scrap of flesh hanging from its bones, not the faintest trace of meat. It looks like it's been gnawed clean by a vulture or a stubborn oh my gosh, I can't even speak English today. Meticulous, good grief, insect. Some kind of repulsive animal anyway. This is because generally when I think about this scene, I can never think about chicken in the same way, so it's all going round in my head, I'm sorry. Louise then turns this act into a geste by washing the carcass with soap and positioning it in the middle of the table as a trophy of success of her rebellion. Sinemani builds suspense by leaving the horror of the chicken carcass until the second sentence. It consequently shocks the reader. The carcass is expected to be in the garbage, yet it is placed in the middle of the table, spotlessly gleaming. It stands as an omen of death, foreshadowing Louise's serial killings, while at the same time representing a symptom of the nanny's psychosis. Taking revenge in the heart of the employee's house, Louise's revenge symbolises how the nanny, as well as her 19th century counterpart, of which she is an avatar, occupies the middle of the home with the power to destroy, disturb, and derail family life. The rotting carcass may also represent the idea of the maidservant as the bringer of disease and vice into the 19th century home. In conclusion, this paper has demonstrated, I really hope, how Chanson douce destabilises a discourse found in 19th century literature surrounded by the maidservant. The uneasiness surrounding the servant figure in the 19th century is echoed through the nanny figure in the home of the 21st century. The genre of le roman de la servante can be traced from the 19th century to the 21st century, with its influence also found in film. Chanson douce has been adapted into a film at the end of last year by Lucie Bortolot, becoming part of a growing production of various international films being produced around maidservants and their 21st century avatars. For example, Domestica, Parasite, Roma, and The Chambermaid and The Housemaid. These films, along with the increasing publication of diaries of 21st century cleaners, allows le roman de la servante to be transformed into the 21st century genre of le roman et le film de la femme de la ménage, or the book and the film of the cleaning lady. Thank you all so much.
And thank you so much for two really, really fantastic papers to set us off with, Jessica and Jemima. Really, really, really rich papers. So I can see lots of applause. And now I'm also looking for questions. But who would like to launch the process of asking a question? And I'm scanning here. To see if anybody's asking.
I'll kick us off while people just have a think about their questions.
Yeah.
So a question for Jemima. What I was really enticed with, because I've read the diary, the journal of Ernaux, and obviously I've looked as well. I'm starting Les Années, but I thought what was really interesting is that you pick out a lot of how she looks at objects and how this relates to herself and how you get this biographical sense. But I thought what was very interesting as well is that in the journal she looks at people, and it's through people that she can see herself. So I just wondered if you'd sort of made the connections between these sort of, you know, she's looking at her room and these objects, and this is how she's sort of portraying her entrapment. Whether you could just tell us a little bit more
about sort of how she might relate to people in this way.
Yes, or if you had any thoughts on how it's sort of objects versus people, and how this sort of creates this sense of entrapment that she connotes in her work. I hope I can answer your question. I think I'm looking at space. I think I specifically because I was sort of really wanting to hone in on this sense of, and I'm sure lots of people here have probably looked at Ernaux before, and will recognise that she has a sort of penchant for the physical. She talks about her books being places where she meets other people, or she meets people from her past. But I think it was the place that I wanted to sort of really get into there. The book being a space. She talks about, again, I think a lot of us will know about Ernaux, talking about how her je is one that is transpersonnel, but she also talks about the je being a lieu, a place where people come and go, and she invites the reader in. So yeah, I think that was why I sort of went down that route with it. But definitely I think there's a lot of people in various different spaces as well. Yeah.
We have a question from Emily Hook.
Hello. So I'll just put my video on so you can actually see me. Oh, there we are.
Hello, Emily.
Thank you both for such interesting papers. What I found really interesting, especially in Jess's talk, but also kind of in Jemima's talk as well, is the thought of class guilt. So you've got I think you said something about the placing the hardship on the nanny, Jess, and it's kind of like she was outsourcing her postnatal depression. And I was wondering if you could say something about that, and the kind of guilt of maybe not looking after one's own children, kind of having them and then going off to work, that I know many mothers feel. And also, Jemima, I was thinking about the nice dress that's hanging there, and that she's, despite all of the hardships she's suffered, she still seems to be longing for this kind of to be part of something that she's been excluded from. And I was wondering whether you could say something about class guilt in that kind of context of a longing to be part of something that you can't be.
I'll go first then. Thank you so much, Emily. They're fantastic questions. I'm going to start in a bit of an anecdotal way, because before lockdown in February, I got to actually meet Layla, and I asked her some sort of similar question, actually. And one of the first things that she said to me was, imagine a Russian doll. and that the powerful woman, the woman that goes out, has this fantastic career, is the sort of big doll. And what we don't see is all of these invisible women that help her to be this amazing sort of powerful woman. I know Lisa Downings wrote a fantastic study on selfish women, and that how women who choose their careers and choose themselves are seen as selfish because they don't abide to the traits of a woman, sort of being maternal and being sort of passive, but also that she's choosing herself. So I think in this sort of class guilt as well, we sort of have this underlining sort of feminist discourse of what makes a powerful woman. And I think what's very interesting is like in Sidney's text, where are the men? The male characters do not have, they're always seen through the eyes of women. I think there's definitely something going on with power relations in terms of, as soon as the mother decides she wants to go back to work, straight away it's, well, you're going to, by the time we give them the nanny the money, you're going to be earning the same, so what's the point? And there's this whole idea of having your own liberty. Why aren't you looking after the children? And I think straight away one of the things that Silmani looks at is that it's not the mother's fault that her children got killed, that it's, there's this discourse. I think there's even a nice paragraph that talks about, people blaming her for not being there. I think it's what really interests me from the very start is, and this is to do with master and servants as well, is this codependency on each other. So you find that Silmani kind of refers to, okay, the nanny really needs them for a sense of existence, for a sense of belonging, but they equally need her so they can go out, they can have their freedom. And I think it's a very fine line, because I think as well, a lot of people use family members, sort of grandparents, etc., for childcare, but when we start using a stranger in the home, things become a bit difficult. And I think it's, when are you exploiting people? So yeah, I hope that's answered your question to do with sort of class guilt, that it comes from an even bigger discussion of, well, should women be at home looking after their kids 24/7? And I think because a lot of us here as well are either in academia or looking to go into academia, that this is a big discussion as well to have. We need the support to be able to move around, especially if we've got family. So thank you so much for your question. I'll pass on to Jemima.
That was great. Thank you very much.
Hi, Emily. Thank you. That was a really, really insightful question, really interesting. And I absolutely agree with you. I think there is this sort of running alongside the class guilt and the sort of the hardship, and you're saying the sort of the suffering and the embarrassment. There is still this longing, and I think that's really what I'm trying to sort of hone in on, is the tension. There is both. There is this longing to be part of something, something that she is excluded from, and that she recognises some part of herself will always be excluded from. But there is this aspirational quality. I think even sort of, you mentioned the dress itself is clothes are such a marker of class and of self-expression, I think, particularly in a sort of adolescent sense. So I think it is this tension, this ambivalence that really interests me, because I think absolutely it's all there sort of at once.
That's great, thank you. Also, just as a comment, I really enjoyed your point about the tension between proper ways of being a woman. So you've got the dress contrasted with the books. Mm-hmm. I just thought that was a really excellent point. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Françoise has a question.
Hi, thank you to both of you. They were both very, very engaging and insightful papers. A wonderful way to start the series off. So I have a question that's mainly directed to Jess, but it's trying to draw on parallels that I started thinking of listening to both papers. So I've been spending a bit of time thinking about Slimani's Chanson douce in relation to Qui gardera nos enfants by Caroline Ibos. So this is a sociological study, and it's I think Jess is pulling it out there. Yeah, wonderful. So what I was interested in is the portrayal of space and the way that might relate to your analysis of Slimani's reworking of the the maid narrative, and in particular, if there were any comments that you could make about the space of le square and how that relates back to what you were saying towards the beginning about the reverse of ethnicities between Simoni's characters, etc. Notions of mobility as well, relating to Jemima.
Thank you so much. That's a fantastic question. I read this book quite recently, and it actually felt like Simone had sort of lifted sections out of it. It was so similar, because you find that it talks. It's more of a scientific kind of study throughout. Sort of, it's based on your African nannies in Paris, and how they form a community in the centre of a square. And which we get in Chanson Douce, because we get these nannies that are all of a sudden all together in this one space. Silmini herself said that what interested her, because she writes her novels and she writes her work in Paris, is that who's around in the daytime. And I think as a student you can see this as well, or as an academic, depends what you do with your time, but it's that the people that are out in the winter, especially when the summer's not there for everyone to enjoy, are the unemployed, are nannies, are sort of SDF, your homeless people, and so she looks at like how they form a community in this square as well. So it's very similar. Interestingly, how they form a community in Chanson Douce, yet Louise is always on the outside. So she has one friend, Wafa, but we kind of gain a set. She won't let her in too much, and I think it's only when she sort of gets drunk that we get like a tiny insight into Louise sort of appreciating her company. But as to mobility, I think this is it, isn't it? That she's very confined to the home. And this is what, like, I sort of started my paper off with trying to show you, that it's very, because she feels so confined, I think starts triggering some of these sort of behaviours. And I think it's because that she doesn't integrate herself into any of these spaces. I haven't actually looked at mobility very much and to do with space, but I think it's very interesting that you brought it up to say that sort of the square is the sort of social hub, and all of a sudden when she starts, because in these books what they notice is it's the time, and it's in Chanson Douce, but when she does the survey and like starts to get to know real nannies, that's the time where they discuss their employers, and it's this sort of little gossipy centre as well, where they start to talk about either really interesting employers in the sense of, oh yes, this person gives me my house and all the rest of it, so I feel the need to have to give them more, but also in a sense of this is the place where they slate what's going on and their exploitation. So I found that in that sort of, it was their sort of space till I think it's in this book as well as in Chanson Douce, occasionally it's this, what happens when the employer invades that space, because that's meant for them in the daytime. They also have to be very careful of what they do with children as well. I think that's hopefully addressed your question. I mainly have my thesis at the moment, we'll see how it produces, but concentrates on revolt in particular. So I haven't considered space as much, but I think this is really interesting because for me, I've looked at space in terms of how they become parasitical characters. So in the sense of, I've looked at how houses change. I'm just going to throw this in as a nice little thing, but in the 18th century, in the late 18th century, house plans change. So they start to move the servant quarters. So when you see sort of in the basement or in the loft or even outside of the home, the servant quarters are distanced away, and even with the kitchen, etc. Whereas in the 17th century, the servant quarters were right next to where the master and mistress slept. Also, the kitchen was very close to sort of communal salon, so they could actually, walk from the kitchen through the salon into sort of intimate spaces. Whereas all of a sudden in the late 18th, and this gets replicated in the 19th, because they even have then their own staircases that they have to use. It's very interesting in respect to, Louise, her space, she's in some sort of banlieue is what we imagine her. She's in some sort of really sketchy area where she comes into the centre then. And we find that a lot of people in the Caroline book is that she talks about how they're all on the periphery. So, they're not just on the periphery of life in our minds of these invisible women, but physically. So thank you, Francois. It's given me a lot to think about.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was very, very informative, and yeah, absolutely answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, if Jemima, you're not coming in on that one. So there's a question from, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Alice Furness. And this is, Jessica mentioned the image of the chicken carcass, and it made me think back to the comment she mentioned that the children were eating her alive, as well as Louise's obsessiveness. Is there any link between Louise and the chicken carcass back to that idea of being devoured too, is Alice's question.
Thank you so much, Alice. I think that's a really great sort of matchup of ideas there. I think it's really interesting. I think being devoured, I'd probably see it more as this is the deterioration of a woman's mental health slowly happening throughout this novel, and we're kind of finding out, you kind of want to know all the time why she's killed these children, and that's what keeps you turning the pages. But I think it's this idea of like, you know, you're being eaten from the inside as well. I think there's definitely, because of this claustrophobic relationship, this idea of being devoured, they feel like they're being, you know, it's very Hegel, as in, you know, we define ourselves through other people. And it's this idea that as soon as the parents feel like they're being devoured, they like sort of try and remove themselves, which makes her cling on more and feel like, you know, oh, I'm not being loved enough. And it's this really toxic claustrophobic relationship where they need each other but don't want to need each other. And there's an absolutely fantastic quote that's on the lines of it's when we won't need each other anymore is when we'll be happy. And I think that kind of sums that up. I'm going to bring this back to the 19th century because why not? It's the best period. It is this idea of disease and dirt. So you're talking about this carcass, like sort of, you know, really deteriorating in this sort of toxic, right in the centre of the home. And this was the idea as well, that maid servants and even working class women were considered to be the dirt and disease of the home. It even crosses with race at some point as well, because you have 19th century discourses. There's a fantastic book called Imperial Leather that talks about how maid servants were in fact in the 19th century drawn and considered as black because they were considered as so lower class that their race and this idea of dirt and disease had to be tied into race. So there's even drawings of maids where their faces are black, even though it would be assumed that certain not every sort of maid servant was black during this period, but it was this idea that race and class were interconnected in that sense. But yeah, I think it's very interesting of this idea of the postnatal psychosis of something like deteriorating inside. Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I hope that's answered it.
I can't see anybody else with their hand up right now, so I'm just going to come in on that if that's all right, and abuse chair's privilege. I think that's a really, really interesting question, the idea of how mutual dependency can express itself via food and the subversion that you're talking about there with the chicken. While I was listening to that, it reminded me of another servant who does amazing things with a chicken, but in a quite different way, which is the protagonist in Marion Diay's La Chef. And I would love to see a closely worked out comparison of those two extreme presentations of the poulet as a centerpiece. It's maybe a little bit left field to ask you to say anything about that right now, but it just struck me.
No, I think that's brilliant. I think it's a really good comparison because it's through food that interestingly, and I think this is exactly the same for Louise actually, so it's a really good comparison because it's through food that these sort of servant characters feel like they've got a grasp on their sort of employers. So they feel that they can really feel when they're fulfilling their needs, they're sort of, oh, I've got you now. And even in La Chef, it's really explicit. She says, they're under my control now. I'm the real master here because I know they've got this intense greed where they just need the most luxurious kind of food. And I think that's really interesting in terms of, well, food is the sort of familial setting, and that they're the people serving the food, but they're the people outcast as well in the familial setting. So even because what's interesting about La Chef is we don't know what period we're set in. And I think it's interesting in terms of Louise at one point even starts cooking for family events. So she starts like cooking for their friends. She even starts making vegetarian dishes on the side for the friend that's vegetarian. And for a long time, she's not even invited to the meal. So she's cooking the meal and then going home. And so this is the idea that it's this beautiful food, and they talk about the nanny or my nanny, but it's never Louise. It's never that. They're still, even at the centre where their food is at the heart of this setting, they're still outcast. But I think it's really interesting in terms of the chicken, because I've got a friend that I did a similar paper, and she was sort of telling us that in Poland the chicken carcass is one of the best bits to eat. So it's just on different settings, the way we look at different bits of food, I think. But what's interesting in the film of Chanson Douce is that they do intense zooms of these scenes. So one of the things, when I said about she doesn't like the children wasting food, she's obsessed with yogurt pots and the little bit left in the yogurt. So what we get is an intense zoom of this child licking. She says you've got to lick it out, like, lash. And so she's like, lashing the lovely yogurt, and we get it's really claustrophobic. So they make claustrophobic senses out of food. So we get like the chicken carcass and that horrifying image, but we also get little bits of her serving food that's really intense. So I just think this is a really interesting comparison. Thank you for the Mariende. I'll definitely consider that. Thank you.
You're really welcome. Beth Kearney now. Excuse me, Beth Kearney has a question for Jemima.
Thank you. Hi everyone, sorry if it's a bit dark here. I'm on the other side of the world, so it's quite late at night. But thanks so much. I hope I'm not derailing the conversation. I think the food aspect was really interesting. But I was just kind of thinking about the painting that you talked about, Jemima, by Dorothea Tanning. Am I right? It's been a while since I've read Mémoire de fille, but I was really struck by this passage as well. But in my mind at the time, I was studying Gothic fiction, and Dorothea Tanning, like you said, is a surrealist artist, but also very influenced by Anne Radcliffe. And in my master's thesis, I was looking at surrealism and kind of how space and like the visuals and poetics and all the rest is kind of like a metaphor for the spaces of inside the mind. So and the doorways, so in sorry, I hope I'm not blabbering on here, but my question is that I think it would be really interesting for you to look at space in that literal sense, because obviously that is really important, but also like in a psychological sense, especially because Ernaux, as we all know, talks a lot about like desire and sexuality, especially at that young age. And she was quite, from memory, she was quite alienated by her sexuality at that time, or it was traumatic. So she has a very multifaceted perspective on sexuality, we know that. But the doorways represented in Dorothea Tanning's painting, I would argue, are kind of inspired by Anne Radcliffe's representations of doorways in space and kind of the labyrinthine spaces of the castle as a metaphor for women's sexual desire. And the reason for that, if we want to go back to 18th or 19th century fiction, is in these kind of buildings, Roman, I don't really know how to pronounce that, it's a German word, but it was hard to represent desire in explicit senses. So Gothic authors kind of use metaphors to talk about young women's sexuality. I'm sorry that took so long to talk about it, but it was a lot of kind of intertext, and I hope you followed. But yeah, thanks so much for your presentation. I was just wondering if you could talk to that, or yeah, anything. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Beth. That's absolutely fascinating. That's really, really interesting, because I think you bringing that sort of perspective, I didn't really know anything about the painting itself in terms of its Dorothea Tanning's influences and things like that. I think that's really interesting, and sort of thinking sort of more metaphorically. It's something that I think the paper that I presented today is sort of in the context of my full chapter, and in the bit sort of before this analysis, I invite my reader to sort of consider different ways of thinking about space. So as I was saying before, the writing I as a space, or the book itself as a space, or as a room. But I think that is something that I should definitely look into more, because that's absolutely fascinating. I probably will send you an email at some point, maybe, just to talk about that, because yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
Yeah, feel free to send me an email if anything. But yeah, really interesting ideas. Thanks so much to both of you.
C'est le grand silence from what I can see. Are there any further questions or comments? Yes, so Beatrice Ivy has a question. Beatrice.
Hi everybody, hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you everybody for your, thank you Jemima, thank you Jessica for those really fascinating presentations. And I might be covering old ground here because Jessica, I know we've spoken about this at length, but so that's my main question is for Jessica. Just to say, Jemima, thank you very much for that presentation, and the way you described the anxiety of the threshold really resonated with me right now. I don't know whether it's just because of confinement and the pandemic, but that's going to stay with me. I think we're going to be thinking about that for a while. But yeah, Jessica, I was just really interested, really fascinated by your paper, and it made me think as well about some of the criticisms that are levied at Slimani in terms of her politics towards racial politics in France at the moment, especially, and sort of her refusal of looking at things through a colonial lens, or thinking about post-colonial legacies and things like that. So I was wondering whether you thought of approaching that kind of race reversal from the perspective of like a decolonial feminisms, as sort of put forward by Françoise Vergès at the moment, where she sort of says that white bourgeois feminism is built on the exploited labour of women of colour. So and then that ties into the race reversal that's going on in Chanson Douce as well. So is that something you thought about, or something you would speak to?
Yes, there's actually, I completely forgot who's written this, so forgive me, but in Liverpool Press's sort of just before the recent edition, as somebody has written on sort of this sort of post-colonial La littérature du monde of Leila Slimani, and how she refuses. So really, I'll definitely, if you're interested, I'll send you that in an email, but she looks at it from the perspective of Leila refusing to be, there's fantastic interviews in some of her sort of, I'll get them off my shelf for you so that I can illustrate what I'm talking about. 1 second. She has these fantastic texts that are these interview ones. So she gets interviewed on her work, she gets interviewed on what she thinks as a writer, and she tells us that, I'm not a Moroccan woman, I'm not a French woman, I'm just a writer, and when I'm at my desk, this is how I am, and I could be a man, I could be a Russian, this is who I imagine myself when I'm writing. And this article kind of picks up on this and shows that actually it's very difficult in this position. For example, one of the interesting things that this picks out, which I always thought was very interesting, is these blurred lines between the mistress and the servant in this text, because Miriam walks in to hire a nanny, and they think that she wants to be a nanny because they look at her and think, well, you're a Moroccan woman, and they kind of tie it together. And so what they kind of do is they kind of, this article ties in with Leila writing as a Moroccan woman, refusing to be fit the role. So I thought that was very interesting. But from my point of view, it was very much, I'm looking at it in terms of sort of the master-servant dialectic. So I look at in terms of, say, Georges Sand. I found this very interesting because it gives us a different perspective on race as well, because you've got two Creole women, and one of them is inferred to be the white mistress, and then you've got sort of the black maid servant, and how these blur. And I think in terms of in that novel, and then how it's transposed in the Slimani, is that race is it's very difficult, because she doesn't want to make it a book about race, but inevitably by doing that, and this is what this article kind of looks at, you do insert it. And the interview scene, which is definitely taken from the Caroline Ibo in different ways, as well as potentially Slimani said she interviewed nannies herself for her own children. They have a lot of times where they talk about the immigrant women that come to be interviewed for these jobs. And I think, well, how can we not talk about race when all of these women, and the studies done on how many women now, say in France, but also in Europe, are coming from all of these different third world countries to look after our children, what's happening to their children. But I think in the sense of the sort of racial question, it was interesting to me that she calls it herself a revenge. And I was thinking, well, and this is what I've hopefully addressed in my paper, this is very ambiguous to call something a revenge when the employer as this mixed heritage woman is this, this is revenge that I get to be the boss. But what is she trying to say? That the boss suffers in the most ultimate way? Her children get killed in the end by the hands of a white woman. And I think there's a lot of ambiguity there to tackle and to go into, which interests me in a way because she's so explicit with, well, I'm standing from this point, but also I don't want to talk for immigrant women. So it's a bit, but what's interesting as well is in this interview scene at the start, they say, we don't want to hire we don't want to hire sans papier. So that is, people without their papier that are going to be illegal immigrants, because of the fear that if they needed to contact the police, the emergency services, they would be too scared for their own rights as a citizen to take care of the children. In another novel, which is really interesting, in her first novel, Dans le Jardin de l'Orgue, another family discuss with the main protagonist there, oh yes, we'll do sans papier for the little jobs around the house, but not for our children, good grief. And so there's a definite line between declaring, not declaring, and using these people. But I hope I've kind of addressed that inevitably race is there. But I think there's so much work that has been done on sort of the post-colonial aspect of Leila and the way she stands with her position. I mean, she's just finished a book that's just been released in English, if people don't want to read it in French, but called Sex and Lies. And that looks at the sort of liberation of Moroccan women. It's Le Sexe et le Mensonge, and it's just like, well, that's the non-fictional work that she's looking at. And then her current work that's just come out this year is Le Pays de l'Autre, and she looks at her family, so she fictionalizes her family moving to Morocco. So inevitably race, I think, is in these texts, but I think what I'm trying to look at is this, how it into like sex into this codependency or these master and servant relationships.
Thank you, that's really comprehensive, and you really do illustrate that tension that you talk about in your paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. It's a difficult question.
Okay, are there any further questions? I just had one little one for Jemima, if that's all right, Jemima. And I was just wondering about this question of confinement in space and domestic space and inhabiting and claiming space in Ernaux that you've done such a good job of analysing in Mémoire de fille. I was thinking about the shift in that sense of claiming space throughout Ernaux's oeuvre, in fact. And I always end up at Usage la photo, partly because you've been talking about photographs as well. But how do you see the presentation of domestic space in that work by contrast with the work you're looking at?
Thank you, Shirley. That's a really good question. I think perhaps l'usage de la photo is maybe sort of the antithesis maybe of what I've been sort of talking about today. It's sort of a hyper curated sort of text. I don't actually have it in the room with me, but for anyone that doesn't know, it's written between Ernaux and her lover, and it features photographs all the way through that they've taken of scenes of sort of disarray of that have been left by lovemaking, or different sort of places, hotel rooms, kitchens. But this disarray is also a sort of very, very consciously constructed disarray. Things are sort of placed. The clothes that are sort of thrown around are very, very sort of bourgeois. The settings, the hotel rooms, there's lots of sort of voiles, sort of curtains, and there's sort of writing, paraphernalia, and things. There's markers of class throughout l'usage de la photo, but it's also very much a text that is directed. It's about sort of claiming and exhibiting space. And Ernaux actually, at one point, again, I'm sure anyone who's read the text will remember this, is a quote that's quite often from L'usage de la photo, but she imagines the camera lens as sort of stand-in penis. So this is how she frames the way she talks about this. So I think this is sort of a very, I feel like this is the sort of culmination of where she comes from. I think Mémoire de fille is the very beginning of that. I think it'd be really interesting actually to look at that bedroom photo from Ernaux alongside sort of a direct comparison would be really interesting, and sort of picking out those details where you can see the construction, because there is something, again, like Emily was saying, there's something very aspirational, there's a longing, there's something, she's wanting to sort of project a very particular image in L'usage de la photo, and arguably in Mémoire de fille as well. So I think it's really interesting to see that, to pull through the trajectory through the works like that.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm just scanning and I can see
just one comment.
Nothing further except, from
Beth in the chat.
Sorry, I'm missing something. Oh, sorry, Beth's comment. I do beg your pardon, yeah. So Beth Kearney says, I wonder whether the ambiguity or inconclusiveness of the revenge ending, obviously not of Ernaux's work, is just the point. The author's resisting the comfort and reassurance of a clear ending. I don't know if you've got anything to say about that comment, Jess.
I think as well, like she purposely says on many interviews, I want to make you feel uncomfortable, like from the very start. And I think just to bring it to the film, actually, that this is exactly what the film does. It's how many different film techniques can we do to enhance how uncomfortable this book can make you feel. And I think this is through the short sentences and the lack of, it's power in some respects, as much as the first time I ever read it was very frustrating. You're there thinking, well, why has she done this? I think I just want to bring back the revenge idea that seems very explicit in. It's a revenge for me to say that, the immigrant's suddenly the boss. And I think I just want to bring it back, that a revenge for who and why. And it's just very ambiguous, I think, to say that it's a revenge ending from who, because at the end of the day, Louise is in a coma as well. She doesn't get off scot-free. She's gonna, she's in a coma, she's slit her throat, she's in the worst possible way. The children are dead and this family's destroyed. So a revenge for who is my big question. But yeah, thank you for the comment.
I think also, and then I really will be quiet as chair, that this question of reader discomfort, of generating reader discomfort and how you do that and why, it's really interesting actually in both projects. I don't know if you've got anything else that you'd like to add about that more generically, or either of you, Jessica or Jemima.
Just that, absolutely, I think discomfort and sort of mirroring and sort of emotionally mapping, I think, and that sort of, to sort of use another very spatial turn of phrase, sort of, I think that is absolutely what is going on in these sort of moments of holding and rhythmic sort of pull and push and sort of pushing the sort of readerly face in things, or sort of shutting us out as well alongside the characters. Absolutely. I think readerly discomfort is key to both of our papers, actually, definitely really productive.
I'm going to spread this out a little further to my project, but what's very interesting, because I've started to look at this 21st century diary accounts from French cleaners, is that it kind of reflects the Mirbeau, Le Journal d'une femme de chambre, where you get the first person perspective of a maidservant. At least these are actual cleaners writing. It's not Mirbeau sat trying to imagine. And what's interesting about all of these texts is that they use humour to talk about their discomfort. So there's quite a lot of discomfort, but we're going to use comedy. And that's just, we see that in different films as well, that comedy is used to describe difficult situations. And I think it's very interesting that these novels have also picked up on this comic aspect, because there's quite a lot of dark things in Le Journal d'une femme de chambre that isn't too nice, but there's a lot of humour in it. You're meant to be laughing with him at the certain things that happen. And the 21st century, less known but still existing, that are slowly coming out about cleaners, they're laughing at their employers. They're thinking, you're treating me like this and I'm going to laugh at you. And it's through their texts that they're like tackling the discomfort. So yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for those answers. And I think we have no further questions that I can see.
Oh, Dominique's just jumped in.
Oh, Dominique's jumped in. Yes, Dominique. There is still time.
It was okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you to both presenters. I really enjoy your presentations. And that's a question for both of you. And it's also a general sort of question. Based on your research, would you say, has class a new importance in contemporary women's writing, in your opinion?
Thank you, Dominique. I'll go first. Sorry, just to clarify, are you saying sort of is class still important?
Has added a new importance, or more importance than it had originally? When really women started to write, I felt gender was really at the center of women's exploration in fiction. Would you say that class has a new importance?
I would say definitely, absolutely. I think particularly with sort of the current climate and where we are with sort of thinking about race issues, I think class and race can't really be talked about in isolation in lots of cases. I also think as well, I think it's always been important, but I think it's something that, you sort of say how at the beginning people talk about gender. I think it's something that's quite hard to get at, because it's something that is so complicated, and that was something I think in my own research that I found quite difficult at first, and that's why I sort of came to looking at space, for example, with this particular text, because I think you need something to get in to find it, because I think as Mémoire de fille kind of attests, it class is sort of it sort of insidiously kind of creeps through everything, and I think it always has been very important. I do think there is a sort of shyness or nervousness about talking about it or about tackling it in text. So I think absolutely there is a new importance, but I think also we sort of need to renew and sort of pick up the baton again, if you will. So absolutely, yeah, I do think so. That was my perspective anyway from my research. I don't know about Jess.
I think it works really well with mine, because at the moment, I mean, this might change because we're only in first year, but the idea behind my project is to trace this 19th century figure all the way through to 21st century texts and films. And one of the things that really pulled me, because a lot of people were like, why don't you just concentrate on the 19th century figure? It was this idea that why are books and why are films still being made about maids, about cleaners, about nannies? Why are we doing this? And it's because it's still addressing, for me, this is sort of my underlining theories, but we're still addressing that problems that we had in 19th century master-servant relationships are still underlining certain master-servant relationships we've got in France, and that like class is inevitably involved in that people are still being exploited and treated in the same similar senses. And this is what I'm trying to pick out with some of the 19th century novels, of this discourse of fear, this idea of the rebellious maid is transposed all the way through. And that I think because of these, like, these texts that have been written in the past 5 years by non-famous contemporary women writers, you've got fantastic writers such as Ernaux, who also in one of her novels does become a cleaner, which is quite interesting. But you know, you've got these big writers, but also these completely unknown women that are just writing their perspective, that they're talking and they're saying yes. And for me, what's interesting is I'm now, and this is my objective at the moment, I'm going to try and categorize this as a genre in its own right. I'm saying, well, you know what, there's enough work done on this now that class in terms of cleaners, nannies, servant type figures in the 21st century have their own, you know. So I think when you say new importance, for me, definitely, because I'm looking at how even in your sort of big colossal films, sort of the Korean Parasite that won the fantastic awards, that's basically about servants. They enter the home, and it's this idea that this discourse hasn't disappeared, that it comes from somewhere else, but we're definitely, I think it's, and this is what I'm hoping, that through my research I can sort of even put a bigger importance or greater importance, whatever you want to call it, on class. But I couldn't disagree with Jemima. I couldn't agree with Jemima enough. I should say that that it is very difficult to talk about, and this is, and I think this brings up the subject of intersectionality. That, you know, your class is tied in with your race and with your gender, and that it all comes together. But I think, yes, finally, in a way, we're moving in a certain sense towards this idea of class and where we fit. So thank you, Dominique.
I think that really nicely closes the seminar, while open again to the continued importance of expressions of class in contemporary women's writing. There's a little note from Claire saying this has been a wonderful inaugural seminar in the series. Thank you so much. So I'm going to thank the two speakers, Jessica and Jemima. You were really great. It's kicked the series off brilliantly. Thank you to everybody for coming. It's really nice to have a good turnout like this. Thank you for your questions. Please do get in touch with the three of us if you have your own ideas for ways you would like to help us carry this seminar forward. And yeah,
see you on the 22nd.
The rest of your day, and see publicity for the next one.
Yeah, so we've got some fantastic speakers lined up. So we've got Francoise and Kira, and we're going to hear their papers on the 22nd. So make sure that's in your diary. Same time and place. We're all in our rooms. But yeah, it would be great to see you all there, because we're staying with the class confinement and criminality, the 3 C's, but we're going to have a completely different interpretation of texts. So please be there or be square.
We're all square. We can't help it. We're in. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Everyone, thank you so much.